Hello, everybody. One of the more persistent and depressing subjects that we focused on in this show over the years is prisons, poverty, and race in America. We did a show with a woman called Keita Haynes on her journey from prison to politics, a kind of redemptive narrative, bending the arc. Not all the narratives have been quite as redemptive. We had Daniel Hatcher on the show talking about how the US criminal justice system commodifies children and the poor. His book is entitled, appropriately enough, Injustice, Inc. And then more recently, we had Ben Austin on the show, the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. We haven't done that many histories of the American prison system, why and how it evolved into what it is today. And that's changing because we have the honor of one of America's most distinguished historians. Robin Bernstein is a professor at Harvard University and the author of an important new book, Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Robin is joining us from Hudson, New York. She normally lives in Watertown, just outside Cambridge. Robin, before we get to Freeman's, a very distinguished historian, how centrally would you put the evolution, the narrative evolution of the criminal justice system in America, particularly in terms of race, in the broader context of American history?
Well, I'd say it's extremely important in part because it connects to the history of capitalism. So the history of capitalism is fundamental to the history of the United States, and the history of justice, how we think about justice, and the history of freedom. What is freedom? What is justice? What is appropriate for commerce? These are all fundamental questions about the United States, and these are all questions that come together in Freeman's Challenge. These are all questions that come together in the carceral state.
We've done lots of shows also, as you can imagine, done lots of shows altogether, but particularly on American capitalism. We've had guests on the show who have argued that the foundations of American capitalism are also racist and bound up in slavery and the post-slave system in America. In your observation about capitalism, is that what you're saying? Is there a close connection between race, prison, and capitalism in American history?
Oh, without any question, absolutely. And there's also a very close connection between slavery and incarceration. And there's a very close correlation between slavery and capitalism and incarceration and capitalism. All these things are knitted together. And all of these things were actually being formulated and reformulated at the same time. And in some cases, there was direct communication. So one thing that's really important in Freeman's Challenge is picking out the connections between the invention of prison for profit, which happened in the American North, not in the American South, and it happened long before the Civil War. So I'm pulling forward those connections between the invention of prison for profit and slavery in the North. So this is an exact place where race and racism and slavery and capitalism and incarceration were all connected, all at the same time. And what my book does is actually unpack that.
You might call it a perfect storm, or probably more appropriately, it's an imperfect storm. America is very different. Its carceral system, perhaps its capitalism, certainly its history of slavery from other advanced industrial countries. Is there something for you unique then about these forces?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, it's not unique in that, first of all, I mean, the United States is connected to the entire globe. It's also not unique because the system of prison for profit that was created in Auburn, New York, very quickly got exported, and that system quickly influenced Europe in particular. So we have, even if it was unique in its absolute origins, which is what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the originary moment. Even if it was unique in many ways at that moment, it very quickly became non-unique because it spread. And now it's a dominant model in many ways throughout the entire world.
But in America, the existence certainly of prisons and for-profit prisons and the numbers of people in prison and the black-white imbalance, they are much more disturbing than other countries in the world, aren't they?
Oh, that's absolutely true. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation in the world, and the racial disparities are horrific. So, in New York State, for example, where I am right now, and what the book is about, New York State. In New York State today, 73% of people who are incarcerated are Black or brown. And 73% of the population of New York State is most certainly not Black or brown.
Yeah, and then the other number, and I'm sure you know this one, is the numbers of black men in particular who have in their lives been in American jails. What's that number, Robin?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that number right off the top of my head. Ask me something about the 19th century. I can tell you those numbers off the top of my head.
Well,
I
what
don't
would you
know
guess? I mean, what is it? I think it's certainly an
the
astonishing
last
number. One in
the
five,
last
one in six.
It's more than that. It's much more than that. The last number that I heard was that 1 in 3 African American men in the United States is in some way involved in the criminal justice system, either on parole, has been imprisoned in the past. That's a number, but I'm not going to quote you that number in any sort of definitive way. But yeah, it's a horrifically high number. One phrase that is often used is that a Black man in America is more likely to go to prison than he is to go to college.
And viewers and listeners, if they want to find out this depressing number, I'm sure can Google it. I want to get specifically to the book in a few minutes, but more broadly, one of the headlines, you did a radio interview with Robert Scher, who is a very distinguished progressive media figure. The headline on the piece that you did with him, on the piece you did about the book, was America's prisons are slave labor factories. Is there an intimate connection, in your view, as a historian, between American slavery and the American incarceration system, Robin?
Oh, absolutely. There's a famous phrase that profit-driven incarceration is, quote, slavery by another name. That's a phrase by Douglas Blackman, and it is absolutely correct. So incarceration, in particular, profit-driven incarceration, and most in particular, convict leasing. That is to say, when a prison actually sells the labor of incarcerated people to some sort of entity. It could be a private entity, it could be a corporation, it could be a state, but that labor, that forced labor, is sold to the highest bidder in some cases, and the people who are incarcerated have no choice but to work. So that system of profit-driven incarceration, that system of convict leasing, it emerged in the wake of slavery. Now, the story that a lot of people have told, Douglas Blackman, Ava DuVernay, the story that they've told is the story of how prison for profit, profit-driven incarceration, convict leasing emerged after the end of Southern slavery in the United States. So
Mm.
after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment. And that's absolutely true. However, the story that I'm telling is how profit-driven incarceration and convict leasing were actually invented 50 years earlier. They were invented not in the South, but in the North. These systems that Douglas Blackman and Ava DuVernay and some others are describing so well and so importantly, that system was actually based on the North. It was not a Southern invention. They were adapting a Northern system, but that system also emerged in the wake of slavery. In New York State, slavery ended in 1827, and it ended gradually. And at the exact same time that slavery was ending gradually in New York State, some white entrepreneurs in central New York, in Auburn, a small town called Auburn, invented this idea of prison for profit. They invented it exactly at the moment that New York State was transforming from a state that was based on a slave economy into a state that was based on state capitalism, an economy that was based on state capitalism. So these things are absolutely intimately connected. And we might ask, what's the problem with starting the story with the Civil War and focusing on the South? Shouldn't we focus on the South? Absolutely, we should focus on the South. But when we focus only on the South, when we only start the story at the point of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, what we're doing is we're starting the story in the middle. And the problem with starting the story in the middle is that when we do that, we inadvertently let the North off the hook. My goal in Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit, is to put the North back on the hook. I want to remind people about Northern slavery, about the Northern invention of profit-driven incarceration. And I want to tell that story through one person who was a teenager named William Freeman.
So I'm listening carefully to you, Robin, and please correct me if I'm wrong. You seem to be suggesting that as slavery was ended in the North, and I use that word carefully because, of course, it wasn't everybody in the North, and we may come on to determining who was actually making these policies. But the North reinvented slavery in the form of for-profit prisons. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. So, one of the interesting things about the Auburn State Prison, which was the prison that originated some fundamental ideas about prison for profit, which I'm sure we're going to get to. One of the interesting things about the Auburn State Prison is that when it first opened its doors, when it had its very first set of prisoners, as far as we can tell, 100% of the prisoners were white. So it wasn't so much from the very beginning that the prison was interested in re-enslaving African American people who were in the process of becoming free through gradual emancipation. That was not the original goal. The original goal was to enslave people. The original goal was to extract free labor from people and use that extraction in order to change the economy of Auburn and change the economy of New York State. So at its absolute original point, it was not a necessarily racist endeavor. Race was not the point at the beginning, but it didn't stay that way. Race very quickly and racism very quickly became central to the Auburn State Prison and to profit-driven prison more broadly. So one thing that's really important to know is that the Auburn State Prison went from having zero prisoners of color to then having many, many, many more. And by the time William Freeman was incarcerated, William Freeman, the subject of my book, he was incarcerated in 1840. And by that point, 1 in 11 prisoners were Black. So that was about 9% of the prison. So the prison went from 0% to about 9%. And that's a huge jump. And to put that into perspective, at the time, Black people constituted approximately 2% of New York State's population. So by 1840, Black people were overrepresented in the prison by more than fourfold. So the prison for profit very quickly became a way to re-enslave African Americans disproportionately.
How does history work, Robin? You're a professor at Harvard. You have quite a title. You are the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African American Studies and the studies of women, gender, and sexuality. So you're as I said, one of America's most distinguished historians, the author of several well-received books. Is there something invisible that drives these things? In your reading, I know you're very empirical and you're going to dance around this question, but was there something ineradicable about racism that resulted in this reappearance of a kind of slavery in the prison system? Might have it emerged in something else had it not been the prisons? I mean, and maybe let me revise that question. Do you have a philosophy of history? I mean, all historians do, whether they acknowledge it or not.
Yeah, I love that question. Absolutely. So, first of all, I believe that nothing in history is inevitable. Um, we look at history backwards. We look at the past, and it's very easy to think that certain things had to have happened the way that they did happen. But in fact, nothing has to have happened the way that it did. History is made by individuals who act in concert. They often act in concert without intending to. And this is one of my beliefs about history. And, I think this is true about history, that really takes center stage in Freeman's Challenge. Part of the book is narrating the emergence of the racist libel linking African Americans to criminality. That is a lie. It is a libel. And it can seem, and it's so prevalent now, this racist libel is so prevalent today, that it can seem like surely people always believed that. But in fact, of course they didn't. This idea has an origin. This particular and virulent form of racism has an origin. And one of the points of origin, I argue in the book, is actually the trial of William Freeman. So in the trial, William Freeman did commit a crime, and he went to trial. And he had a very famous lawyer, William Henry Seward, who later would become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. But even in the 1840s, he was already very famous as having been the governor of New York State. And the prosecutor was also very famous. He was John Van Buren, the son of President Martin Van Buren. And these two people made very different arguments about why William Freeman committed the crime that he committed. And William Henry Seward saw himself as a reformist and a crusader against racism. And John Van Buren pretty much embraced racism. So these are two very, very different people. However, inadvertently, they acted in concert. And inadvertently, what they did was both argue to connect criminality to Black people. They both made this racist argument, even though they made it for different reasons and in different ways, and they thought of themselves as very different people, but they came together. And to go back and answer your question, this is how I think history works. Very often, people who see themselves as very different, who see themselves as being on different sides, they come together in a way that they did not intend and did not expect. And in those moments of people coming together, that's when something happens. And it didn't have to happen, but it did happen.
So rather than Marx, perhaps it's Max Weber's unintended consequences that drive history. We are speaking with Robin Bernstein, the author of a fascinating new book, Freeman's Challenge, a book about, and it's Bernstein, not Bernstein. I knew I was going to make that error, Robin. That's a Bernstein libel. We are speaking, as I said, with Robin Bernstein, author of Freeman's Challenge, an important book about the origins, not just of racism in America, but its criminal justice system. I want to thank our friends at Liberties Quarterly, excellent new publication focusing on culture and politics that publishes many distinguished writers. I don't think Robin Bernstein's been in it, but that quality of writing. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Robin to talk specifically about her book, Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profits. I'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Robin Bernstein, the author of Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Robin, as you said in the beginning of the show, as a connection between the origins or the development of the American incarceral system and capitalism. How radical, how different was the idea of prison for profit in the middle of the 19th century?
It was extremely radical, especially at its origin point, which was 1816. So by the mid-19th century, it had spread and it had become one of the standard ways of standard philosophies of incarceration. But at its original point in 1816, it was absolutely radical. So up until 1816, prisons existed for some combination of three reasons. Those three reasons were they existed either to punish people, or they existed to reform people, to help redeem them and help them become better people in one way or another, or they existed to control people, that is basically to get them off the streets. So these were the three reasons that prisons existed. And then in Auburn, New York, in 1816, a group of white entrepreneurs came up with a radical new idea. And that radical new idea was that a prison could be an economic tool, that a prison could exist not primarily to punish people or to redeem them or even to control them. The primary purpose of a prison could be to generate wealth. This was an absolutely radical idea. And they had this idea because New York State was in a process of moving towards something called state capitalism, which has at its core concept that one of the central goals of the state, one of the central functions of a state should be to stimulate an economy. That was at the time a relatively new idea. So at the time, New York State was starting to survey the Erie Canal, which is the hallmark of state capitalism, this massive infrastructural project for the purpose of stimulating the economy of New York State. Then unconnected to that, so it seemed, was a new prison opportunity. So at the time, New York State had one prison. It existed primarily to punish people, but it was overrun and it was notoriously corrupt. So the state offered a contract of $20,000 to build the second prison in New York. So from the state's perspective, a prison and the Erie Canal were completely separate, completely distinct entities. However, this group of white entrepreneurs in Auburn had this insight, which at the time was an amazing novel insight, which was that if they took this contract and built this prison, the state money that would come into Auburn to build this prison could stimulate the local economy very much in the same way that the money to build the Erie Canal was stimulating the economy of New York State. So to give you some context, the amount of money in this contract was $20,000, which is about the same as $500,000 today. At the time, Auburn was a tiny little village of about 2,000 people. So you can imagine if you have a little village of 2,000 people and you flood that village with $500,000 in cash all at once, with more money to come in perpetuity to run the prison, that is going to completely transform the town. Now, to us, that's really obvious, but it's only obvious to us because of the work of these white entrepreneurs. So that was their idea. And then they had a second idea, which was they could not only suck this money out of the state, they could also suck labor out of the prisoners. So they built this prison around a set of factories. They built factories inside the prison as they were building the prison. And the concept from the very beginning was that these prisoners were going to be forced to work in these factories that were built inside the prison. They were going to receive no pay whatsoever, and their labor could be used for whatever the prison wanted. So the prison was going to be sucking money in two directions, from the state and sucking labor that labor that had monetary value out of the prisoners. This was, and that all of this was going to be used to to build wealth for local entrepreneurs, to build wealth for local businesses, to build wealth for the city. It's the city itself, the village that would become a city. And this was at the time a completely explosively radical.
So what were, coming back to the prisons, because of course prisons have always existed, what was the traditional prison before this prison for profit? How would you compare and contrast the standard prisons that existed in America before this?
Well, it's hard to say what the standard prison was, because prisons have some kind of punishment has existed for a very, very long time. Confinement of people who have committed some sort of wrongdoing, that has existed for a very long time. But it's really hard to say what the standard was, because this was a moment when the standard was being created.
In a sense, is it, again, coming back to Weber, is it a rationalization of prisons? I mean, everyone at the turn of the 19th century had all sorts of people radically rethinking prisons. You had Bentham and the utilitarians coming up with the idea of the panopticon. You had de Tocqueville coming to America in the 1830s, looking at American prisons as a model for Europe. So this was intellectually and economically a time of great, for better or worse, reinvention of the idea of prisons. I mean, Foucault has written extensively about this. It's a fascinatingly rich subject, isn't it?
Yeah, well, let's talk about de Tocqueville. So de Tocqueville came to Auburn. At the time when the Auburn prison was built, there was basically the dominant model for a prison was the model that was called the Pennsylvania system. So the Pennsylvania system, which was based in Philadelphia, this Pennsylvania system had at its core the idea of reformation. It had this idea that the central goal of a prison should be to help prisoners become Christians, to help them become not criminals, basically. And the Pennsylvania system had a terrible way of doing that, which was it put people in solitary confinement, in total solitary confinement for their entire incarceration. And the idea was that this would give people nothing but time to reflect on their crimes, and it would cause repentance. So this was one of the dominant models for incarceration at the time that the Auburn prison was built. So it was, of course, what we know, and what they knew even then, was that solitary confinement is a form of torture. And solitary confinement does not cause penitence. What solitary confinement causes is madness, and it destroys people. So the Auburn State Prison said, we're not even going to worry about redemption. We're not even going to worry about reformation. We don't even care. What we're going to do is replace that goal of reformation with the goal of generating profits. And the Auburn State Prison also used solitary confinement. They put their prisoners in solitary confinement every single night. Each prisoner was incarcerated in an individual cell every night. And let's be very clear, solitary confinement is torture, whether it is permanent total solitary confinement, as in the Pennsylvania system, or whether it's every night, as in the Auburn system. So in Auburn, they were incarcerated in individual cells every night. And then every day, they were forced to work in these factories. And in these factories, they were working together, but they were not permitted to speak to each other at all. And that is very hard to take in. They were not allowed to speak to each other at all, ever. So when William Freeman was incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison at the age of 15, he had a sentence of 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. So he was being told essentially at the age of 15 that he was not going to speak another word until he was 20 years old. So this is the Auburn system, and this is how it contrasted with the Pennsylvania system, the competing prison system at the time in the United States.
So, and was de Tocqueville impressed with it? Did he see it as quote unquote innovative, or was he horrified?
De Tocqueville was not horrified. So de Tocqueville visited both the Auburn State Prison and he visited some Pennsylvania prisons, and he wrote extensively about the Pennsylvania system versus the Auburn system, and he was pretty equivocal about it. He did not come out in favor of either one. He did not come out against either one. He thought that they both had merits, basically, and he brought them both back to Europe.
And is there a count? I mean, you obviously have very strong feelings on this, but is there a counter argument that these people had committed crimes and that in the old days they'd go into terrible places, prisons, which were like Bedlam, probably horribly violent. There wasn't solitary confinement, but they nonetheless were violent, disgusting places. So these were modernized versions. These people had committed crimes. They were producing wealth. They were repaying society for the things they did wrong. Is there any veracity in that, or is that just an absurd argument?
Well, first of all, let me be really clear that the Auburn State Prison was an enormously violent place. So the Auburn State Prison was characterized by whipping and by waterboarding and by solitary confinement, and that none of these forms of violence, and there was also just beating. William Freeman was beaten horribly. He was beaten with a board. He was beaten so badly that he sustained a brain injury, and he also became deaf as a teenager as a result of a beating in the Auburn State Prison. So you really can't say that the Auburn State Prison was somehow less violent than any other prison. The Auburn State Prison was one of the most viciously violent prisons in the United States.
Sorry to interrupt, Robin, but were there rules?
Oh,
or were the guards and the authorities essentially allowed to do whatever they wanted?
yes and yes. There were rules. There were a lot of rules, and the guards were basically able to do whatever they wanted. So yes, there were very elaborate rules at the Auburn State Prison. The biggest one was no speaking at all, ever. Another of the rules in Auburn was that prisoners were not permitted to look at each other in the face. They were not allowed to look at each other's faces at all, ever. And this, again, is so hard to take in, the violence, the torture of being so socially isolated, not being allowed to speak, not being able to look at another human face. And these rules were viciously enforced. Of course, people did find ways to evade them, but that was very, very dangerous. Anybody caught uttering a word, anybody caught looking at another human face was whipped and beaten horribly and waterboarded. So it was an enormously violent place.
So let's get to William Freeman. Your book is called Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. Why is this case, or why is William Freeman so important in terms of the narrative of prisons for profit and the race issue, of course, as well?
Yeah. So William Freeman was an African-American and also Native American teenager. He grew up in Auburn, New York, and he was part of the most prominent Black family in town. His grandparents had actually been, been part of the very first set of people who had established Auburn. In particular, his grandparents had established Black Auburn, a neighborhood called New Guinea. So, and this was all very shortly after the genocide of the Cugas, who were the inhabitants of that land and the people who held that land. But then there was a genocide that was led in part by General George Washington. So, or ordered, I should say, by General George Washington. And then that
the same Washington who is the founding father of this country.
Absolutely, absolutely. He ordered what was called Sullivan's Campaign, which was a campaign of genocide, which which stole the land, and then gave the land and sold the land to white people. And some of the white people who originally stole and took that land were the Hardenbergs, who were the enslavers of William Freeman's grandparents. So William Freeman was the freeborn grandson of the most prominent Black people in town, people who were credited with establishing the Black neighborhood of Auburn. And when he was 15 years old, William Freeman was accused of stealing a horse. There was no hard evidence against him, but that didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. And what made William Freeman important immediately was that he resisted. He resisted the theft of his labor. He immediately spoke up and he said that he did not want to work in the Auburn State Prison because he had committed no crime, and also because he was not a slave. He was a free person and he deserved to be paid for his labor. And remember, none of the prisoners were paid anything for their labor. So he resisted, and there was enormous retribution against him. As I said, he was punished horribly for this, for his resistance. He got out of prison at the age of 20. He was deafened through his beating in prison, and he suffered a brain injury. And he kept up his campaign against the Auburn State Prison. He sought legal remedies. He tried to sue in order to recover what he saw as back pay that the Auburn prison had stolen from him, that they owed him for his labor. And he tried for 6 months to recover back pay. And he was laughed at and he was dismissed. And then what he did was he resorted to violence. He committed a murder, and I'm not revealing anything. The murder is in the title of the book. He committed a truly terrible murder that then caught
Who did he kill?
Who did he kill? He killed a white family, and
A whole family.
He killed a white family.
How many people?
4 people. It was a quadruple murder, and he was very clear that he was killing because of the Auburn State Prison. He was killing as a strike against, in resistance to prison for profit, and that his real target was the state. Now, all those people who had laughed at him and dismissed him, well, after he committed this murder, they couldn't laugh at him and they couldn't dismiss him anymore. So they had to grapple with his challenge. Now, part of the reason it was so difficult for people to grapple with his challenge was that the Auburn State Prison was actually the economic engine for all of Auburn, and arguably in a lot of ways.
Sorry to jump in here, Robin. Why is that a challenge? What's the challenge of murdering a white family? Why is that a challenge?
Well, it was, the way I look at it was that it was an act of terrorism. And the family was actually not directly connected to the Auburn State Prison. And that was really important, because the way the Auburn State Prison worked economically was that every single person in the city of Auburn and its environs was economically tied to the Auburn State Prison. Auburn basically functioned as a kind of company town where everybody was connected in one way or another, either directly or indirectly. So there was no boundary. And that's actually how the Auburn State Prison worked. It worked to decimate boundaries. Everybody was implicated. So William Freeman killed a family that was not directly connected to his incarceration or to the prison, but they were connected in the ways that everybody was connected. So what he did by killing a family that was specifically not directly culpable for his personal individual incarceration, what he did was he identified the general culpability, that everybody was implicated.
At least in his mind. I mean, not everyone would.
Oh, no, not everybody agreed with it. Certainly not.
And not everyone would. I mean, could one argue it was a form of madness, that he was so badly beaten and so terrorized and traumatized by his prison experience that he just went mad and killed these people?
That is exactly what people argued at the time. That is exactly
But
what
you don't agree with that. You're giving it more of a political reading.
It's not that I think he was not mentally disabled. He was mentally disabled, and I'm really clear about that in the book. I do talk about his mental impairment, and I do describe exactly the ways that he was mentally impaired. However, one of the claims that I'm making in this book is that it is absolutely possible to have a mental disability and to make a rational claim. There's no contradiction there. So, on the one hand, he did have some mental impediments. He absolutely did. He was a brain injured person, and he was making a very important political point. And both of those things can be true.
What was the political point then, as you say, in murdering a family who weren't directly connected with the prison or his own incarceration?
The political point was that the Auburn State Prison had stolen his labor. The Auburn State Prison, that the political point was that prison for profit is a system of organized theft disguised as justice, and that the entire endeavor was itself a criminal endeavor.
So let's fast forward, Robin, to the 2020s, where there are many, many prisons for profit. I'm not sure if you're put in a jail whether you're paid for your labor, but are you suggesting that his behavior, Freeman's behavior, has a degree of legitimacy that might be replicated by other prisoners of the American system?
Well, I'm certainly not advocating for murder, and I'm certainly not advocating for terrorism. I mean, William Freeman, he committed a murder, and I name it as an act of terrorism. And I'm not saying that these are good things in any way. What I am saying is that William Freeman was articulating a claim that we should listen to, and that the claim has been obscured by his methods. And I am not advocating for his methods. What I am saying is that he was making a fundamental claim that is important for us to hear today. The fundamental claim is that it is wrong for a prison to profit off of incarcerated people. It is wrong for a prison to exist primarily to benefit, to create economic benefit. Why should one person benefit economically from the incarceration of another person? William Freeman was making the fundamental point that that is wrong. And I think that is something that we should all listen to.
Did he write something down here? I mean, where do we know that this murder of the family was a political act? How do you interpret that?
Right. Well, he did not write. He did not write
So
anything
presumably
down.
he said something at the trial.
Yes, yes. Well, he said many things, and he was interrogated at length, and there's an enormous archive of evidence for what he said and also what other people said about him. So William Freeman's life was very highly documented, and I have lengthy footnotes in the book, or endnotes in the book, where I show all the evidence in this story, because it's kind of an incredible story. And it's easy. A lot of people ask me, did you make things up? I made up nothing. I invented nothing. It's all in the evidence. So the trial, when William Freeman went to trial for murder, the trial got very big very fast. It was called the trial of the half century. And the murder trial was covered nationally in the press. And people were just hanging on every word of this trial. So there was an enormous record of what William Freeman said, what people said about him. And this is where I found the evidence for the political act.
Robin, what did other prominent African Americans, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, I know they appear in your narrative too. What was their interpretation of Freeman's, what you call Freeman's challenge or the Freeman case?
Yeah. So it was complicated. So Harriet Tubman is really important to the story because very shortly after William Freeman's trial, Harriet Tubman came to Auburn and she settled in Auburn. She bought land from the wife of William Henry Seward, and she settled in Auburn 2 miles from the Auburn State Prison, and she chose to live there until her death in 1913. So she lived there for the second half of her life. And she knew members of William Freeman's family. They worshiped at the same church. So here she is, 2 miles from the prison, knowing members of William Freeman's family, and she never commented on it. She never said a word about it. And similarly, Frederick Douglass was somebody who was also very clearly aware of the Freeman trial. There's no question that he knew about it. It was reported on in his own newspaper. So if we can assume that he read his own newspaper, the North Star, he knew about the case. And the way that Frederick Douglass responded was to start coming to Auburn. Frederick Douglass never came to Auburn before William Freeman's trial. But then immediately after the trial, he starts coming regularly to Auburn. And he starts telling not Freeman's story, but his own story. Frederick Douglass starts lecturing on his own life and lecturing on abolitionism in Auburn immediately after the trial when he had never done that before. And he starts coming back over and over. And then he publishes one of his autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom. The very first publisher of that book was an Auburn publisher, one of the very first. It was published simultaneously in several places. So what these abolitionists were doing was they were coming to Auburn, and instead of directly engaging with this act, which was terrifying, and this act that was morally repugnant to a lot of people, instead of directly engaging with William Freeman, what they did was their own freedom work. What they did was tell their own stories, articulate their own stories, and regain the narrative, reclaim the narrative.
So are you then suggesting that there was some beneficial consequences to what Freeman did? Or is it just accidental?
No, it's not
weaving
accidental.
together this narrative, Robin. There are moral implications, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, it was not coincidental at all. So the ways in which Douglass starts showing up in Auburn and showing up repeatedly immediately after the trial when he had never done that before, there's no way that that's just a coincidence. Harriet Tubman settling there, that was not caused by William Freeman. That she came to Auburn for, in part because it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and some people in William Freeman's family were actually involved in the Underground Railroad. His uncle Luke was involved. So, did anything good come out of this? That's a really hard thing to say. Freeman's challenge. Freeman succeeded in frightening a lot of people. And he succeeded as an act of terror, he succeeded in terrorizing people. But he did not succeed in getting what he wanted, which was pay for his labor. He did not succeed in changing the prison. So in these ways, the challenge lay fallow. And what he was articulating through his actions was buried and muffled. So what I'm trying to do in this book is hear him. I'm trying to hear what William Freeman was saying. And I'm trying to hear the argument that was muffled and forgotten.
Although, and we got to end, it's a fascinating conversation, Robin, but you talked at the beginning of this conversation about the what you called the racist libel at the heart of the American criminal justice system. And this Freeman case represents, I guess, in a sense, the racialization, at least in your argument, of America's original prison for profit. Didn't this action add credibility, if that's the right word, to the racist libel?
No, absolutely not, because the racist libel did not exist when Freeman committed this act. So, this racist libel of connecting Black people, Black and brown people, to criminality and suggesting that there's some sort of biological connection there, some sort of inherent propensity, that idea was almost unheard of at the time. That idea was actually partially invented through the trial.
I mean, that
So,
was my point, but it
mhm.
wasn't just invented. I mean, here was a man who killed a white family. So
But why? So the question is why? So Freeman never talked about race as part of his motivation for the murders. He never talked about race as part of his anger at the Auburn State Prison. He was really clear that what he was angry about was the theft of his labor. He never connected it to race. The ones who connected it to race were his lawyers and the opposition lawyers and the white people in town. They were the ones who racialized the case and made it about race. For Freeman, it was about incarceration, capitalism, and theft.
and finally, Robin, I can't resist asking you this. You'll probably dodge it as well, but 170, 100 and more than almost 2 centuries later, Donald Trump isn't shy to bring up race. As America and American jails now, as you suggested at the beginning of the show, lead the world in terms of the numbers of people locked up, and the appalling majority of them seem to be African Americans. Has America changed much since William Freeman?
Oh, of course. I mean, America has changed in a lot of ways since the 1840s. So, I mean, there's no question that it has changed. In terms of incarceration, well, mass incarceration did not exist in William Freeman's day. So that's something that is a huge change. The numbers, there's no comparison between the numbers of people who were incarcerated in Freeman's day and the numbers that are incarcerated today. So that's one huge change. And then another really big change is that now, today, one of the ways that prisons move money, one of the ways that prisons extract money is by charging prisoners for things. So in William Freeman's day, his labor was being stolen from him. However, he wasn't being charged for anything. So, but today, of course, prisoners have to pay for a whole lot of things that are, in fact, necessities of life. In some prisons, people have to pay for soap. People have to pay for toothpaste. People have to pay for menstrual products. These are not luxuries. These are basic necessities of life. And that is a really big change as well, in that the prisons are now sucking money from multiple directions, including directly from incarcerated people.
In other words, what you're saying is America's got worse in the last couple of 100 years.
With regard to